Hello everyone. The last lecture we looked at demand. This lecture we're going to look at supply. Specifically, we're going to look at the theory of supply, equilibrium, and then focus on the interaction of supply and demand. These are key elements for economics, so let's get to it. Unlike with demand, with supply, we're focused on the sellers. So here we're at a park. We've got several food trucks, and the owners, basically sellers, have used their magical transport devices to come check on what's happening. Now, we're interested in Rudy. He's the guy in the middle there selling some tacos and nachos. And right now he set a price of $1 for tacos and $2 for nachos. And he's going to be kind of curious on whether he should continue selling these items, shouldn't sell these items. How is it going? Well, what we're going to be looking at for him is supply. Now, the law of supply basically says that as prices rise, the quantity supplied rises. As prices fall, the quantity supplied falls. So as he looks around at these different people standing there thinking coming to buy, he's got to consider if he wants to raise his nachos or not. If he raises his nachos to $3 and people are willing to buy them, he's going to keep them at $3 because he's going to supply more of them, and maybe he'll get rid of some of his tacos that he's only selling for $1. So let's look at how supply and the supply schedule and the supply curve works, because it's going to be basically the opposite of demand. So if you had listened to the lecture on demand, you'll see that the supply basically works the same way. We're going to have a supply schedule, and of course this schedule is a table, and what we're looking at is here are the prices that Rudy can charge, and let's just say for tacos. And here's the quantity that he's willing to sell at each price. Now notice when the price is 0, he's not going to sell any. He's basically going to say, why would I give away free tacos? It cost me money to make them. But at $1, he says, I'm only willing to make 8 because it's maybe not really worth his time and effort. At $2, you know what? He'll spend a little bit more time and a little bit more resources and make 15. And of course, at $3, he'll make 22. And then we've got a supply curve over here, and it is a graph. Now, one thing you may have noticed that the curve goes up now. So this is a positive slope. Now, with a positive slope, now we've mostly been looking at negative slopes. All the demand stuff was negative slopes. With a positive slope, the thing that's important to remember here is that both sides are going to rise at the same time, or both sides are going to go down at the same time. Whereas with demand, we had opposite. So in demand, if one side was going up, one side was going down. But with supply, what we're going to do is find that both of them go the same way. They're either both going to go up or they're both going to go down. That's one of the critical differences between supply and demand as far as when we're graphing them out. But just like with demand, the truth is that Rudy's a single person. He's not the only supplier in town of tacos. So let's take a look at what we talk about as the market supply. So we've got Rudy, and we now have his competition, Adriana. Adriana is new to the business. She's got a different type of taco, maybe a street-infused taco, and she's basically going to also be supplying the marketplace with tacos. Well, this chart looks much like it did for demand. We've got Rudy's supplies, we've got Adriana's supplies, and if we add them together, we've got the total market supply. Again, this isn't too hard because we already know what Rudy was going to supply, and Adriana has figured out her system. And so in total, if I was living wherever they're at, this is the amount of tacos that would be available depending on the price that's being offered. We can do the same thing we did before. We're going to know what Rudy's supply curve is going to look like. We'll see Adriana's supply curve, and then we're also going to see the market supply curve. And of course, it works the same way. We add these two together. Basically, we're going to be adding this part and this part together, and we're going to get the market supply. Again, remember, if you look over here, price does not change. The price will stay the same in all of the supply curves. One thing that you may have noticed this time is that I went ahead and set everything to 40. Why did I set everything to 40? Because I knew once we looked at our market supply, 37 was going to be our total. And so 40 is just a little bit above that, which makes these charts look a lot different because they're not going all the way up to 40. So again, got to understand that your X and Y's coordinates need to be basically the same to really help you see what's going on. So this is not too much different than demand. We've got these basic concepts. Let's keep moving on. Again, like demand, we're going to see shifts in the supply schedule. So let's start with our chart that we had from the last slide. There is one slight difference. You may have noticed that there's not a zero price. Why? Because we know that Rudy and Adriana are both not going to supply at the 0 point. So there's no reason to chart that out. But let's say Adriana has suddenly gotten a really good deal on the shells for her tacos. And because she's gotten a good deal on her shells, it's reduced her cost. Reducing her cost means she can make more profit per item. So this has changed the amount that she's willing to supply at each price. So this is her new supply schedule. Because there's a new supply schedule, there's also going to be a new market schedule. You can see over here, everything has increased as far as the market is concerned. So how does that shift? Well, we see a shift basically going to the right now. And that right shift means that there's an increase in supply in the marketplace. But let's say at the same time that's happened, about a month later, one of the parks closes up. And unfortunately, Adriana can't get the shells anymore. There's not going to be as many places to go. And while Rudy is not going to be too happy either, because he normally goes to the big park to sell his tacos, he does have another location he can go to. So how is this going to affect the supply out there in the city? Well, what's going to happen is Adriana is just going to stay at home, and she'll make a few tacos maybe from home for some of her neighbors. But Rudy, he is going to go out with his truck, and he's going to have some supply. But notice that the overall supply of tacos to the city now has gone down. They're just not as much supply. So what we see is that we have a new supply line, and that means that it has now shifted to the left, and so we see a decrease in supply. So we're going to have a left-right shift, just like we had in demand. But there's going to be a slight difference with this one. Now, when we see a shift, there had to be some sort of a change in a variable of production. Something has happened to the production. Either we've had a profit increase or a decrease, and we'll go through that in just a moment, another slide. But can we have a shift up and down, basically the current curve? And the answer is yes. So let's just say that Adriana was selling here. Her tacos have taken off. She didn't change her production though. She didn't get any reduction in price. So what she's going to do is just simply charge a different price because people like her tacos. So we have a shift up and down the curve. So a change in price is going to move the spot, you might want to say, up and down the current curve, where a change in a variable of production is going to shift the curve to the left or to the right. So let's look at some of those changes in production variables. Understanding what causes a shift in supply is just as important as understanding what causes a shift in demand. Probably the biggest thing that causes a shift in supply is the cost of the materials to produce the actual good or service that a firm is offering. So we're going to use Rudy and his $1 tacos there. Now, Rudy is a good businessman. He's figured out the cost of making tacos. And right now, the cost for making tacos is basically 50 cents a taco. So for every one he sells, it's going to cost him 50 cents. He's going to bring home 50 cents. And so if we follow this white line, let's just say that this is where he's at right now, the white line. And so remember, this is the $1 line. So he's making tacos right here, and he's more than willing to make tacos for $1. And this is what he says he'll do. But he's a good businessman. He's already projecting out. So he starts thinking about the winter, because one of the things he knows is that in winter, tomato costs go up dramatically because they're so much harder to find. Also, he knows his labor is going to tend to go up in the winter. So now it's costing him 75 cents per taco. He's only making 25 cents per taco. And he's got to decide, is he going to make tacos or not? In fact, he might say, well, since my input costs have gone up, I'm going to reduce my supply. I'm not going to make as many. So instead of producing here, he's going to produce over here. He's going to make less tacos because he's making much less money on them. But because he knows he's going to be making less money, he's been thinking about buying some technology. But the technology is not going to be in until the spring. Let's say some fancy tomato slicing machine. And he starts saying, well, what is going to happen in the spring? Well, in the spring, his prices are going to change again, his input prices, because now the cost of tomatoes have gone down, but his labor costs have also gone down. And he's at 53 cents. And he says, well, at 53 cents, I think I'll produce more tacos. And so he could move back to this line, or he could even move up to this line. But either way, since he was there, he's increasing the supply of tacos available to the city. But he also has to consider something else, which is the expectation. What future sales? Are they going to increase or decrease? And as he considers that, he looks at what he saw last year. And this is what he had last year. And we can see that in the winter, he basically didn't sell anything in the park. He says, people don't buy tacos in the winter. They want hot soup. They want baked potatoes. They want chili. And so he's not even going to bother to sell this winter any tacos. He may not even run his truck in the winter. He may just focus on the downtown and maybe a couple of the festivals, but he's definitely not going to be going to the park, which means that there's again going to be a reduction in supply. But come spring, well, he knows that there's going to be a lot of demand for his product, so he's going to increase basically the supply in the city of tacos because he's going to provide them. Well, now this is all fine and dandy, and we really kind of like this, but the city manager, he's been looking at sort of the big picture. And what he did is he figured out how much the city was going to need. So his expectations of what the future for the city needs are. And this is more of a macro viewpoint, you might want to say, of taco demand. And one of the things he notices right away is that while Rudy is, kind of a big deal with tacos in town, he's not going to be able to supply all the tacos that are needed for the town. So what this poor guy is going to do is he's got to think about the number of sellers. So he's going to go and look at all the people in town who've got food trucks, and maybe he's going to go talk to them. Because what he knows is that if he has more people who sell, then he's going to have more supply. And if he has less sellers, then he's going to have less supply. So we know this guy over here, when we saw our original picture, he sells basically salads. The question is will he now sell tacos? And he says, nope, not going to sell tacos. She was doing Asian food. Is she going to sell tacos? She goes, well, I might sell an Asian taco. This gentleman, he's brand new to town, and what kind of food are you going to sell? And he says, well, I'm going to sell tacos because we can see that there's going to be a great demand for it. So as there are more people who are selling tacos, it's going to increase the supply of tacos that are available. But let's just say this new guy right here, he discovers tacos weren't doing very well because these two have basically got the marketplace. And she's like, my Asian tacos didn't go well. So as they stop selling, there's going to be a decrease in the supply of tacos out there. So these are the four things that tend to change the shift in the supply of tacos. And it's going to either shift right or shift left. A little different than demand. We're going to quickly look at 3 questions and see how you do before we move on to the next section, which is going to be a little bit tougher. So first, which of the following moves the pizza market along a given supply curve? Now, this is the key right here, along a given supply curve. So which supply curve are we talking about? Well, it wouldn't matter if it's the white, the pink, or the green, but we're going along a current supply curve, and there's only one real answer here, and that's an increase in the price of pizza. What we're talking about here are the 2 brown dots. We're already on a curve, and we're just changing the price, and so that would be moving it along the current one. Now let's look at why the other ones aren't correct. I always think it's important you understand that. The first one is that when we're talking about a complement to pizza, this is a shift in demand, not a shift in supply. So remember from our demand lecture that related goods are basically going to affect demand. So we got substitutable products and we got complementary products. And here we're saying it's a complementary product. So they're paired together like peanut butter and jelly. In this case, root beer and pizza would go together. But they're shifting demand, and our question is asking about supply. So we should be able to eliminate that one right away. What about a decrease in the price of cheese as an input? Well, we did say input would do something, but it shifts a curve. It doesn't move up and down a curve. So it causes a shift. A fire destroys pizza joint. Well, again, this causes a shift because there's going to be less sellers. So we just went through those. If you kind of got that wrong, might want to just go back a little bit and review those again. Here's another one. Which of the following shifts the supply curve? So this word right here becomes very important. Now we're looking for something that moves the white to either the pink or moves the white to the yellow, but we're asking for pizza to the right. So that means we're looking for something that moves from the white to the pink. And of those choices, we already know the first choice isn't going to be right because that was sort of the answer in the one before. Kind of know B is not right because that has to do with demand and not with supply. So then it's either going to be C or D. And we're looking for an increase. Hopefully you figured out it's a decrease in the price of cheese. So let's take a look at the other ones. As we said, that moves price up and down. This one's about demand. The kitchen fire would cause a shift to the left because there'd be less suppliers. So less suppliers, less pizza. The only one that would cause a shift to the right is if price of cheese goes down, then I might sell more pizzas. I want to look at another one that's a little bit harder. Now, for this one, you're going to need to understand market demand and market supply. And again, if you don't know about demand, please go back and watch that video, because what we're going to go to after this is how demand and supply work together. So here's a scenario that's pretty common. We've got some movie tickets, we've got some streaming videos, and we already know they're substitutable for each other. So what happens if the price of streaming a film goes up? What's going to happen to the movie tickets, the market for the movie tickets? Well, the question is this going to be a supply or demand question? Well, you've got a hint when you look at this because we're talking about price. Now, when we're talking about price, you have to say, well, what type of price are we talking about? Now, the other thing is that down here, we're talking about substitutable products. And over here, we're talking about a substitutable product. And we know substitutable products are about demand. So that means that you should be able to eliminate two of those right away. So in case you haven't figured out by now, it is the demand curve to shift to the right. Now we can eliminate supply because remember, price of an item influences demand, not so much about supply. And even so, it's going to be going up and down a curve, not left or right. And so what about the demand curve shift to the left? Well, there's an increase in the use of movie tickets because what we said is when one is substitutable, an increase in the price of the original, which is the filming stream, will equal a demand for the replacement good. The replacement good is the movie ticket. So we're going to see an increased demand. And if we see an increased demand, we're going to see a shift to the right. So that would be a shift to the right. Again, if you haven't watched the video for demand, please do that. We're going to move on and now start to look at supply and demand together. And this is sort of the heart, you might say, of economics for a lot of what you're going to be looking at for the next few lessons. You've looked at demand, you've looked at supply, you looked at them separately, but the truth is that they're always working together. They're always pushing each other, you might want to say. What we're always looking for is what's called the equilibrium. The equilibrium is this point where the two cross. Now, this is a very important point because basically buyers are willing to buy at that point and sellers are willing to sell at that point. Now, there's a couple other things that go along with this. We know that once we have the point, we understand what the equilibrium price is going to be because that's basically where the point is. And as you can guess, we've also got an equilibrium quantity at that point. Now, you may occasionally hear something called the market clearing price, more maybe for the finance majors. All this is saying is that at this point, this equilibrium point is the place that sellers are willing to sell, buyers are willing to buy, and we can basically clear both groups satisfactory. But sometimes that doesn't happen. What happens if basically the seller produces more than what is demanded? Well, then we're going to get something called surplus, because what we see here is that basically buyers don't want to buy at that price. So buyers want to buy at this price. So we've got sellers having more supply than buyers are willing to buy. We could also go the other way around. We could see that buyers are demanding more than basically sellers are willing to make. In that case, we have a shortage. And so until the seller decides that they want to do something about it, there'll be a shortage for things. Now, this basically brings us to the law of supply and demand. There's this economic phenomena where price will keep moving until we get to that equilibrium point. And that's what we're going to be studying, is not only how do we get to that point, but what adjusts that point? What makes things shift, you might say. And that's sort of what we were sort of looking at coming into this section. We were looking at the shift of supply. We were looking at the shift of demand. Now the question is what happens when they're together? What happens when supply shifts and demand stays the same, or demand shifts and supply stays the same? And that's what we're going to be looking at for the rest of this lecture. So let's get to it. Now that we have a basic understanding of what the demand curve is and what the supply curve is and what equilibrium is, we're going to be able to get into talking about some changes to the marketplace and analyzing how those changes change the equilibrium. Now, I also want you to notice that at this point, we stop using the full words and we start using initials. That is what you're going to see in your textbook. They're going to stop using words for you. It just makes charts a lot easier to sort of understand. So let's set up the scenario that we're seeing right here. So we've got Chef Florence, who's selling lemonade at $3 a glass, and we've got 3 very thirsty teenagers who are willing to pay $3 a glass for Chef Florence's fabulous lemonade. And that's what's reflected in this chart. But something's going to change. And what we're first going to have to do is decide, is this change a supply or demand change? And then once we've decided if it's supply or demand, we've got to decide which direction the shift is going to go. Is it going to go left or is it going to go right? Basically, is there going to be an increase or a decrease in supply, or an increase or decrease in demand? And then once we chart the new line, we need to determine how the equilibrium point has changed. And that will vary depending on the change in supply or demand. So in this particular scenario, let's say that there is a change in temperature. It's gotten very hot. And the hotter it gets, basically, the more people want this lemonade. So what have we had a change in this scenario? It's a pretty simple change. Really, it's a change in demand. So demand has gone up, and we've got a new demand line because we now have 4 people who want lemonade. And this means that we now have a new equilibrium point, and that point is going to be at this particular location because we now have 4 people in quantity. But that's going to have another result. It's going to show that now the price of lemonade can go up to $4. That's what they'd be willing to pay for. So what we find is as the buyers' behavior changed, we saw that there was an increase in buyers. An increase in buyers means a change in demand from D1 to D2. Remember, we're looking for these little initials here. And then that also says, though, that the seller hasn't changed the quantity that they're going to supply. They're still on the same line. So this is a change, not a shift. We're moving up the line, so we've got a change on the line. Whereas this is a shift because we have a whole new line that's been developed. So how do we finally read this? Well, the result is a higher price and a higher quantity. And that's a good example of a change in demand. Well, let's look at another example, okay? Now, one of the things that I think students sometimes pass over is some slight changes in words. And these words are really important. So notice up here on the top that I have written a little cue for you. Basically, if there's a movement along a supply curve, so movement along here, we're going to say that's a change in quantity supplied. And that's what we just said last time. There was a change in quantity supplied. If there's a change along the demand line, we're going to say there's a change in quantity demanded. If there's a complete shift, like we just had, we had this whole line go here, then there's a change in demand. If there's a complete shift in supply, it's a change in supply. Do make sure that you get these in your head, because a lot of times when you're looking at the information that's given to you, they're going to refer to it in that specific way. So here we have our scenario we had before. We've got Chef Florence over here with her lemonade at $3, and we've got our 3 people who would like to buy lemonade. Now, unfortunately, something has happened to the lemon trees. They're not producing lemons like they used to. You can see that half this lemon tree isn't even producing lemons. And so the result of that is that there's now an increase in the price of lemons. Well, if there's an increase in the price of lemons, something is going to happen. Something's going to have to change. And what's happened is that Chef Florence has had to increase the price of her lemonade to make up for that increase in the price of lemons. So how is that going to change things? Well, we now have a change in basically the seller. So we're going to have a change in supply. And in this case, the supply is going to go to the left because we've increased our price. And this is our new line. If we have a new line, guess what that means? Yep, we're going to have a new equilibrium point. And so here we see our equilibrium point has gone to this direction. There's our new spot, and we can see now, of course, we're at $4 because that's our new selling price, but basically we're only going to sell 2 items. And so one of our little people over here, she's going to go bye-bye, I think. There she goes, bye-bye. She's not going to buy lemonade because it's now too expensive for her. So while Chef Florence has had an increase in her price to cover her costs, remember an increase in price is probably going to reduce your demand. So how would we say this? How would we write this up? Well, we'd say there was a shift in supply from S1 to S2, and there was a change in quantity demanded. So the result was from price 1 to price 2 and a lower quantity of Q1 to Q2. Again, come back over here. We moved up and down the demand. So since we moved along the demand curve, we had a change in quantity demanded, but because we actually had a shift in the line, a change in where the line was sitting, we had a change in supply. So let's look at one last scenario where both supply and demand changes. Well, the 2 that we've looked at so far only showed either a change in supply or a change in demand. But could you have a change in both? And the answer is yes. And so we've got our simple scenario again here of Chef Florence with her lemonade for $3 and our 3 little teenagers who want to buy things. So let's find out what's happened. Well, guess what? The temperature went up. And because the temperature went up, we see that there's a change in demand. But at the same time, the high temperature is what's caused the lemon trees not to produce as many lemons. Only half the lemons have grown. And so we have a change also now in the price of the lemons, which is going to result, we know, in a change in price of the lemonade, basically a change in the input. So we're going to have a change in our supply. When we look at this, where's our new equilibrium point? Well, it's right there. We've moved up to this new location. And so what's the result of that? Well, we now have lemonade coming in at $5 and we see a quantity of 4. So we're going to see that our Chef Florence is going to be changing her price over here to $5. And we're going to see another friend has joined in to buy these things. So we can have a change in both supply and demand. So how do we state this? Well, we have a shift in supply from S1 to S2. We have a shift in demand from D1 to D2, which resulted in a higher price and higher quantity. Now, the reason we use the word shift is, remember, we see actual new lines on both of these. If we hadn't seen a new line, we would have either an increase in quantity or we'd have a decrease in quantity. But because we have 2 new lines, we have 2 shifts. I've made this little chart for you. Might want to copy it down because what I've done is I've taken the 3 kind of demands you could have and the 3 kinds of supplies you had and made basically a cross-reference chart for you. And a lot of students can find this very helpful. Now, where you see like here, no set outcome, all that means is that the item could increase or stay the same, decrease. It would depend on what the scenario is. But in many of these scenarios, you can see it's going to go one way or the other. The reason I have 3 words is that sometimes in a test question, you'll see the word be decreased. Sometimes you'll see it say down. Sometimes you'll see it say lower. So let's take a look at one last question and see how well you do on that. So it says the discovery of large new reserve oil will shift the blank curve for gasoline. Now I wouldn't even go into the next section until you can figure out this part. Now, when you look at this, are they talking about buyers? Nope, they're not talking about buyers. And if we've got more crude oil, which is going to be basically a supply for making gasoline, we're going to be talking about supply. We sure aren't talking about no change because we've got new reserves. We're not talking about a decrease, so it's got to be an increase in supply. Now the question is what about demand? So we already know we can eliminate basically questions C and D because those are about demand. We know that it's going to be about the supply curve. Now, again, they go leading to a blanket equilibrium price. They still haven't talked about buyers at all. Nowhere did they talk about buyers. So since they haven't talked about buyers, we're going to say there's going to be no change in demand, which means that there's going to be a decrease or an increase. Well, this is about quantity. They're asking about price. Price means it's going to be a decrease. So if you've got this right, it's going to be B because we're going to see an increase in supply and a decrease in price. So as usual, I'd like to thank you for watching this lecture. Go ahead and check out the companion video. It's going to go over a lot of the questions that you might ask on the exam. The companion video, though, is going to be having a lot of demand and supply interactions on them. So if you haven't watched the demand video, please make sure you go back and watch that. Until later, keep learning.